I felt inspired to do a short video on what I see as the state of the world circa 2020. No doubt you've heard about COVID 19, the frankly appalling response of respective governments to it, the fact that a large majority of the population are completely unable to take it seriously, the riots in the United States over the death of George Floyd, and increased tensions between China and India, and the US and China, and so on and so forth. And it seems like a tangled mesh of issues that point in the direction of one outcome. And in my opinion, that's a global death wish. The problem, as I see it, is that corporatism provides a filter to reward the most ruthless, least forward thinking members of our species. Corporatism is fixated on immediate profit and the reduction of labour costs, also known as exploitation. The individuals who excel at exploiting members of the same species via any number of methods, usually political given the social nature of the human race, and who are invested in short term thinking for instant gratification and profit, therefore conform to the system most successfully. With increased capital comes undue influence over the political operations of our society. However, it does not compute that the most avaricious among us are somehow then qualified to govern or determine our long term future, and in fact, the evidence demonstrates that they are not fit for purpose, which in turn proves that corporatism is a failing system circling the drain of its own self annihilation, which is then made manifest in the collective subconsciousness, a point I will soon return to. Given the neoliberal desire to undercut all public services, many Western countries have been unable to deal with the pandemic. The frankly idiotic decision not to cease global economic activity, particularly tourism, at the start of it due to short term profit seeking interests, couldn't have been more ironic or absurd, given that in a mere month most countries were then forced to make that decision anyway. Was 4 weeks rather than 2 not short term enough for the corporatists? This is how strong the doctrine of corporatist thinking is among the political establishment, who are mostly interchangeable with the economic elites in terms of their mentality. The neoliberal doctrine has also created its own form of haunting, in the form of the riots in the US. People aren't just rioting about institutional racism, they're protesting against their economic subjugation and the lack of a future they have under a failed system. Did capitalism really win after the fall of the Soviet Union, if it's devouring itself now, a mere 28 years later? To return to the original point, those who thrive under corporatism lack conscience, think in the short term, and have a distinct lack of self-awareness. Their talent simply involves the accumulation of capital. The corporation is legally defined as a person and under psychological assessment meets all the criteria for it being defined as a psychopath. In turn, psychopaths are self-destructive to those around them and themselves. The socio-economic framework thereby perpetuates itself by rewarding people who more closely align with psychopathic behavior and who then use their influence to set the agenda for society. As a consequence, the shadow of death permeates the collective subconsciousness because the world that people inhabit becomes increasingly characterized by short-term, impulsive, violent, and destructive activities for personal gain. The consumerist, fossil fuel-driven model of capitalism is a case in point. It destroys the environment, yet is perpetuated because it yields profit for a cabal of oil executives and political insiders. The average person even benefits to an infinitesimal degree via convenience and instant gratification. Many consumer goods are made from plastic, which is cheap to manufacture, and this is derived from petroleum. The entire societal organism is invested in a self-destructive loop, with the psychopathic corporate framework as its brain, and the individuals who conform to it best as its synaptic neurons. This process is repressed, of course, in the mainstream. The integrity of corporatist society is never to be questioned lest you be labelled as irrational or someone who doesn't understand how the real world works. Further to that, people are either too exhausted and disenfranchised to take collective action against corporations to address the issue of climate change, or they simply refuse to engage with the issue at all, instead deciding to live in a matrix-like world of denial. This repression generates a spectre, and the emergence of this spectre is what we are seeing now in full display with the state of the globe at the moment. Many people who voted for Trump could be called racist for sure, and Clinton wasn't far off in calling them deplorables. However, I would add that they don't see a future for themselves and voted for a candidate who would burn it all down, accelerating the decay of the social cohesion that was already initiated with the introduction of neoliberal policies in the 1980s by Reagan. Now that acceleration is bearing fruit in what could possibly be called the collapse of the United States. This is the death drive within corporate society because it is determined by a system defined by death. That death drive now characterizes the zeitgeist, the collective subconsciousness or the spirit of the age. The US is the epicenter of the world as a global hegemon. Even its rivals are influenced by it in adopting similar corporatist systems. The zeitgeist isn't something that elites are removed from either. It is a tornado of unspoken feeling that manifests itself in increasingly risky and destructive behavior with the desire to quote-unquote burn it all down. However, this sentiment is unfocused. What should be burned down are the corporations and capitalism itself. At the moment, we have misdirected rage in the form of increasingly fraught international tensions. Part of that would of course be opportunism and the fact that, as I pointed out, those least qualified to lead are in positions of power due to electorates made ignorant through 24/7 corporate ideology and the suppression of a civic, responsible and empathetic culture, again due to corporatism. But another part of it could be the registering of a subconscious level of the zeitgeist, which is of course traceable back to corporate primacy. The more anarchic and violent aspects of the protests could be part of the death drive that I mentioned, but it's focused on its source, and that is the Anglo-Saxon white establishment that rules over much of the corporate apparatus. In that way, the death drive here is channeled into a desire for life. In other words, the protests could symbolize a reaction against the death of a future anyone would have under corporate tyranny and the disastrous zombie capitalism with which we have been saddled. Now, in the context of the protests, people made a conscious decision to prioritize their political activism over the risk of contagion. But I do find that the behavior of a lot of people in different contexts, for example, consumerism, has been quite frankly bizarre. For example, the stampede of people in Italy for IKEA products when the lockdown was partially lifted. A lot of staff at IKEA complained about this, that they could contract the virus, and people just were not paying attention to social distancing measures. Or the fact that 1 in 5 people in England believe that the virus is a hoax. These phenomena again suggest a death drive in the collective psyche of many, a desire for dissolution, because the corporate neoliberal world they inhabit deserves the oblivion towards which it ignorantly races. Again, the willful ignorance of the system becomes manifest in its consumer subjects and vice versa. It's a loop. So it would seem to me that we're witnessing a world in self-destruct mode, and I'd just say hold tight.